Welcome back. We're in the final stages of the WB-11, which is a 9-page residential offer to purchase. We're going to take a look at pages 8 and 9 now. Page 8 really is all boilerplate. So you're going to want to read through it. Read through it, read through it, read through it, read through it. I can't say that enough. It talks about special assessment. It talks about earnest money. It talks about disbursements. It talks about legal rights and actions if someone's in default. It talks about inspections and testing. So you're going to want to read it, read it, read it, read it, read it. We're going to go on to page 9. And page 9 is our last page of the offer that allows us to fill blanks in as well. Again, double check that the top of the page has the right address. Now, inspection contingency. This is probably the most confusing part of a whole offer to purchase, and it is also one that gets messed up the most and is the most expensive mistake to make. So, that being said, you've got two options here. Number one is if you were to choose to use our addendum KW, our inspection contingency is a little bit different. And so you're going to want to look at that and read through it. Now, if you decide you're going to use the inspection contingency on the addendum KW, you don't do anything with this one. Don't touch anything. Don't type anything in. In fact, what I might do is if I know I'm going to use that, I'm going to do this and I'm going to type in not applicable, just so there's no confusion, right? Not included, not applicable. Now, here's a mistake I see made. You check it here and you fill this one out, and you go to addendum KW and you fill that one out, and now you've got two inspection contingencies that aren't exactly the same. The one on addendum KW is slightly different. And really, where that comes back to would be into the language under the right to cure if there's defects found. So, I'm going to go to the addendum KW in the next video so I'll walk you through that. But let's talk about this. Let's say you are going to use this one. So we're going to go back and we're going to put an X in that box, and we're going to say the contingency only authorizes inspections, not testing. So key here. So let's say the buyer wants a radon test. This contingency does not cover that. You've got to cover that separately. So radon is typically one. Mold test is one that comes up every once in a while. That's got to be addressed somewhere else. This is only for the physical property itself. And it says the offer is contingent upon a Wisconsin registered home inspector performing a home inspection of the property. Another key piece, it's got to be done by a Wisconsin registered home inspector. Now, how do we know if they're registered? Well, the Department of Safety and Professional Standards maintains that registry. What we mean in this, though, is it can't be Uncle Sam who happens to be an HVAC contractor doing the inspection unless we agree to that separately. But in the standard language, you can't do that. It says that that's done of the property which discloses no defects. So that's the first line. It says this offer is further contingent upon a qualified independent inspector, independent qualified third party performing an inspection of blank. So let's say in that example we knew that the roof was near the end of its life expectancy, so we want to get an independent third party out to do the condition of the roof. So now we've carved out another opportunity for a separate inspection than maybe what the registered home inspector would do. If I don't do that, I don't have the right to do it. So again, swimming pool is another one, roof, foundation, chimney. So again, type it in there if they want the right to do that. Doesn't mean they have to. If they don't have it, they don't get the right. If they have it here, they have the right. I don't know if that makes sense. Which discloses no defects. It goes on to say buyer shall order the inspections and be responsible for all costs. Buyer may have follow-up inspections recommended in a written report resulting from an authorized inspection, provided they occur prior to the deadline specified for this contingency on line 421. Inspection shall be performed by a qualified independent inspector, independent third party. That's really what it is. So here's a caution. Buyers should provide sufficient time for the home inspection and any specialized inspections as well as any follow-up. Here's where I see agents make a mistake, and this is line 421. It says this contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless the buyer within blank days of acceptance delivers a copy of the written inspection report and notice listing the defects. So give yourself time here. If we're trying to close June 22nd, I'm going to say 21 days from acceptance. It's a busy time of year. Inspectors are swamped. Now that doesn't mean that the buyer should wait till day 19 to schedule the inspection. In fact, what I would encourage the buyer to do is the minute we get an accepted offer, they're scheduling the inspection. Because in that 21 days, not only do we want to get the inspections done and any follow up, we also want to negotiate anything that comes up so that we don't have to give notice and trigger the next event with regard to the inspection. So, uh, and that's really the key. Now, here's line 424. It says a proposed amendment is not a notice of defects and not satisfy this requirement. I'm going to go through the rest of this, and I'm going to explain then next how this really works. It says for the purpose of this contingency, defects as defined on lines 182 through 184. Now, by the way, one little secret. When I'm doing this with a buyer and filling out the offer, I go to 182 through 184 and I read this definition of defect to them when I'm filling the offer out. When I meet them at the inspection, before the inspection begins, I read this again, and then before we address any issues that may have come up during the inspection, I read it 3 times to them. Now, here's why, because that tends to help get away from them asking for things that really aren't considered defects. And so this is just a way to try to keep the transaction moving smoother. And so that just notice that do not now it says defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature and extent of which the buyer had actual knowledge or written notice before signing the offer. Remember, when we talked about the property condition report, that's where they would have had actual knowledge of something prior to writing the offer. So that says that if they acknowledged it by signing the property condition report, that, for example, the hot water heater was 10 years old, and they didn't carve out an exception about the hot water heater, they cannot come back after the inspection and ask for that to be corrected because they already knew about it. So they should have made the offer with the knowledge that they may have to replace the hot water heater. That's the easiest way to think about that. Now it goes on to say that about right to cure. Now here's the thing about this. So let's go through it, and then I'm going to explain the whole paragraph. I'm sorry. So it says the seller shall or shall not have the right to cure the defects. So if you don't strike either, the default is shall have the right to cure. Here's what I'm going to recommend. If I recommend, if I'm a buyer's agent, that the seller shall not have the right to cure. So I strike shall. And I say they shall not have the right to cure defects as long as I've got enough days in here to get the inspection done and get things negotiated. If the seller has the right to cure, they may satisfy this contingency by one, delivering a written notice to the buyer within 10 days of buyer's delivery of the notice of defects, stating the seller's election to cure, then curing the defects in a good and workmanlike manner, and then finally delivering to the buyer a written report detailing the work done within 3 days prior to closing. So, if I give the seller the right to cure and they agree to that, that's what they have to do. If this says the offer will be null and void if the buyer makes timely delivery of the notice, which would be prior to the end of the 21st day. You gave that notice, and the seller does not have the right to cure, right? So instead of giving the right to cure, we said they don't have the right to cure, or the seller has the right to cure, but they deliver written notice that they elect not to cure, or they don't timely deliver the written notice of election to cure. So here's how this works. And this is the most confusing part of the whole offer and the place where most agents make the biggest mistakes. We've got the inspection contingency. We've got 21 days to get to meet that contingency. So far, so good. Let's say you have the inspection on day 10. You go out, you meet with the buyers and the inspector. You read the definition of defect to them again so they understand what the inspector's looking for. And the inspector does find some legitimate defects. So now I've got 11 days in essence to try to figure out what the buyer wants to do and get buyer and seller in agreement on that. So first and foremost, let's say the defect was a cracked heat exchanger in the forced air furnace. So that's an interesting one because now that the seller has knowledge of it, once we make them aware of it, they're going to have to address it for anyone future trying to buy the house anyway. So it kind of puts the seller in a tough spot. So let's say that's what we found, and so I would draft an amendment to the offer to purchase saying during the inspection found that the heat exchanger was cracked. Buyer requests seller replace the furnace within 3 days prior to closing. And you might get detail like with a high efficiency 90% efficient furnace, that kind of thing. You can try that because now what we're doing is we're opening up a negotiation. So we're renegotiating a term of the offer. It's an amendment, so that's got to be signed by both parties. So let's say your buyer signs it, you send it over to the listing agent. The seller says, "I'm not going to do that. It's fine. I think that it's a mistake on your part. Your inspector was wrong. In fact, I'll get a service technician in to verify." And so now we're on day 12 as an example, and they do that. They have the right to do that. They don't have to agree to amendments, and they go have someone come out and look at it, and that person verifies that it is a cracked heat exchanger. So again, you might come back to the seller and with an amendment saying, now the argument may be, well, I'm going to put a brand new furnace in. It's going to cost me $4,000. You're getting future value of that. I'm getting no value. And so what you might negotiate is seller pays for 3/4 of the cost of the new furnace. Buyer pays for 1/4. I mean, there's nothing that says this is all a negotiation. So that's the thing to keep in mind. Now, that being said, though, keep in mind that you've got a deadline. And if you can't get agreement on those amendments by the end of day 21 and your buyer is adamant that if that furnace isn't replaced, they do not want to close on the house, you then have to draft a notice. So different, amendment is different than notice. You draft a notice of defect, and if the seller doesn't have the right to cure, the minute you deliver that notice of defect, the deal is dead. The deal is dead. Now, let's say you deliver that written notice of defect and you gave the seller the right to cure. According to this language, they now have 10 days to elect to cure it or not, and then go ahead and cure it or not. And meanwhile, your buyer's in limbo. And that's why I don't like giving them the election to cure. I like giving them more time for all the inspections and then not giving the seller the right to cure. Now, again, remember, this is negotiable. So in the course of the negotiation, that might change, but understand how it works. And that's really the inspection contingency in a nutshell. Now, next, let's say we're going to add some addendums. So let's say we are going to add the addendum KW. Remember I talked about it being a rental property, so maybe R. There's an addendum O for occupancy. Let's say the property is built prior to 1978, so we've got lead-based paint. You want to list all the addendum you're going to add there so it's recognized. And then this is a spot to add any additional provisions or contingencies. Goes on to say the offer is drafted by whom. So you type in your name. Um, and of Keller Williams. Whoops, let me get down here. And then on this date, and I drafted it today on May 1st. So, and then got John Smith's name in there. You could pre-type the date or leave it blank. That's the buyer's name. Earnest money receipt. This would be if you received earnest money at the time of the offer. Again, I don't recommend it because we're required that if we receive it at the time of the offer, it's got to be deposited immediately, and then it ties up the buyer's money. So just typical practice. Do it within a certain day of acceptance. And then down here is where the seller can accept. So if they like the offer as it is, not going to negotiate anything, they'll sign that by the acceptance deadline that we put on the top of page 3. Remember that? So we went back to page 3, and that it's got to be done by. Oh no, I'm sorry. It was here on page 1, line 28 by noon tomorrow. So they did that and they delivered it back to us. We're all good. Now let's say they say we don't like everything about it. We want to negotiate. They can do that with a counter offer. Ideally, we want to always make sure that the agent on the other side fills this out and they get the seller to initial if they're going to reject or initial if they're going to counter. Here's the thing to know: it's not required. And so sometimes we get all hung up on that. Ideally, we want to do it, and as a great agent, you want to do that if you're the listing agent. Yet it's not required, and that's the last 2 pages of the residential offer to purchase.